Welcome to our presentation. The presentation is titled, How Did We Get Here? A Brief History of the Last Billion Years by Patrick Tracy. Patrick, I will quickly hand it over to you, but first, would you like to tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yes, can everyone hear? Okay, good. So I'm one of the lucky people. I was not raised in a religious environment. So I consider that lucky. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think of it as that. And so I was pretty much free from a young age to get interested in science and not have to worry about questioning it or except in a scientific sense. You know, it is all about questioning things. So I'm lucky in that way. And I am really interested in science of a lot of different kinds. And my parallel interest would be basically music. And I'm not really a musician. And so I ended up being a sound engineer, basically, and interacting with musicians and the technology. And I basically act as a bridge between artists and the technology they used. And so that's kind of where I am now. And I do a lot of things related to that, video and that sort of stuff, and some web work too. So that's kind of who I am as far as my interests and how I look at the world. And I think a lot about sociology as well, and how humans are the way they are. And I think about the problems we have in the world today, and I try to put all that together and find a way, a path forward out of this sort of big conflict that we are, this sort of ongoing conflict between groups of one sort or another. And so it's kind of led me to some ideas about how to deal with that. I think, Cheryl, you read the essay I wrote, I think, and I don't know if anyone else has, but that's kind of my manifesto. That gives an overall view of why humans are this way, but it doesn't go really deep into the past. And so in this particular talk, I decided I would go way back before humans and just explain why we do things the way we do it, and that it's more of an innate trait. We are a lot more instinctual than we realize. We take actions, and then we rationalize it after the fact, and we think we're making deliberate choices, and in a lot of cases we're just operating on programming that's really ancient. And so I think I'll pop on the screen now and go from there.
So while you're screen sharing, Patrick, just wanted to let everybody know you can interrupt Patrick anytime during the presentation and ask a question. And I'll be watching the chat box and ask questions for you. You can also raise your hand in the chat box. So a rather informal presentation.
So is our screen visible? Okay. So there it is, a brief history of the last billion years, which I hope people get as humorous. And I've already explained that. And this picture just shows like a really superficial outline of the progress that life has made in that time, going from early multi-cell life to and multi-cell life, of course, is individual cells gathering together and cooperating, and it benefits them. And you know, that's what humans do. We gather together and we cooperate, and it benefits us. And we are obligate social animals. And many fish are that way, and early mammals are that way, and there we're like that. So, but before that happened, there was like a really, really long time where it was just single-celled life. It was what's known as the boring billion. You know, not a lot happened. Some life eventually figured out how to photosynthesize in a couple of different ways, and the really big stuff sort of happened a little bit later, and the evidence for this is in a lot of different places, but one of those is iron. The iron that we use for making all our cool stuff, cars and bridges and everything, buildings, was laid down because of oxygen building up in the oceans, and that reacted with iron that had been just dissolved in the oceans, and then it started turning into rust and precipitating out like rain and creating layers of iron. So that was a big change in the way life worked, and it set up the conditions for a lot of other things that the way the world is now sort of started getting going about that time. And we know there was multi-cell life like 2.4 billion years ago. And because of photosynthesis, there was more oxygen, and the iron fell out of the oceans. And then eventually the oxygen started to bleed into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere went from being without oxygen to having more and more and more oxygen. And that is really critical, because what it did is it opened up the option for multi-cell life to get more active. And sometime around 600 million years ago, multi-cell life started getting active. And one of the things it did was predators started to happen. And when that happened, you had basically an arms race. Everyone knows about arms races with weapons. One side gets a better weapon, the other side says, oh, well, I got to do something about that. You know, I need to compete with that. So I'm going to get one maybe just a little bit better than them. And so on, the cycle goes on. And the same thing happens with evolution. You have a prey animal that says, oh, well, it doesn't say, it's not conscious. It just has the fortune to have a mutation that makes them be able to produce a shell or a hard part, and it creates shells, and they become more resistant to predators. And of course, predators eventually something happens and they produce teeth or whatever, and so hard parts happen. And so basically, you had first the oxygen went up, and then animals got more active, and it allowed for predation, because predation is a really active lifestyle. You can't do that without enough oxygen. You can have multi-cell stuff, but you can't have active predation. And that triggered the arms race that led to eventually what you've probably heard of, the Cambrian explosion. So before that, things were kind of like this. You had sponges and not a whole lot else. This is when you had oxygen, but before hard parts really developed. You had these sort of feathery things that stuck in the ground or in the seafloor and absorbed nutrients. And then you had these other sort of flat slug-like things that slowly, slithered around on the seafloor and ate stuff, or absorbed nutrients from the mat of microbes, the microbial mat. But then the Cambrian came along, and all of a sudden, this arms race caused an incredible explosion of life forms, and life forms were developing defensive uh, shells, and they were developing offensive attacks. You know, like this big thing in the middle would snatch up little things, and it had hard teeth. And so it was a big change, but there probably wasn't a lot of social organization among any of these organisms until a little later in the Cambrian. And you had trilobites, which were a little later in the Cambrian. And basically they molt kind of like a lot of insects do, and snakes and stuff. They molt off their outer layer, and then they come out and they're soft and they're vulnerable. And so they're really easy pickings for predators. And there is pretty good evidence that these would, at least some kinds of these, would gather together in large groups and all molt at the same time. And so you kind of had the beginnings of a social organization where organisms, big multi-celled organisms, if by a couple inches long it counts as big, they were starting to behave in ways where they acted in concert. And what this did was made it more difficult for predators to catch individuals, because you had a whole mass of these things that could confuse a predator. And if you gather together in a group, your odds of being the particular one the predator grabs become lower. So, you know, it benefited them in a group sense to gather together and behave in an organized fashion with multiple individuals. And so that's kind of a really early example of what we might call a social behavior. Let's see, checking my notes here. Okay. And then a little bit later, just a couple 100 million years later, this is one of the earliest identifiable examples of group behavior in a vertebrate, you know, animals that have backbones. That probably was happening a lot earlier, but scientists really are only pretty sure about it going back to 220 million years. And the thing about groups, in the case of fish and pretty much everything, it makes you less vulnerable to predators. It makes you, you have advantage in foraging. So you can, like, if you are a predator, you can herd your prey and gather them into a group and concentrate them so they're easier to get at. So it's again, it's an arms race, but it becomes a behavioral arms race between predator and prey. But another advantage is in reproduction. If you're all in one small area, it just becomes a lot easier to find a mate. And so the species that did this had an advantage in that sense. Of course, not every fish schools, and so you can figure there are probably disadvantages, and maybe fish that mostly are active at night don't need to school because they don't have prey or predators that are hunting them by sight. But predation is kind of one of the big topics when it comes to social groups. It comes up all the time. This is it's called a cichlid fish, and these are studied in laboratories and in the wild, and their social organizations are very, very much tied to the kind of predation they experience. And of course, we all know about bees and ants, and they have, most of the bees and ants we know have some kind of social organization. There are solitary examples, either modern or in the fossil record, but kind of the ones we're familiar with do this. And this is a different kind of society. I think it's probably eusocial, EU social. And you've got drones and different types of individuals who perform different functions in society. And they're sort of predisposed to do that from the time they're hatched. But the simple fact that they have formed societies shows the fact that societies have advantages to organisms. And bees have been doing this for 87 million years, since way before the end of the dinosaur times. And ants have been doing it probably as long, but there are examples of what are probably solitary ants around this time as well. Then believe it or not, there were creatures like this in the time of the dinosaurs. If you look at this left picture here, you can see they've put a couple of dinosaurs up there on the surface, and then these little guys in their burrow. So burrowing mammals go way, 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 way back. In fact, mammals and their ancestors have been burrowing pretty much all along for much longer than 75.5 million years. These little guys are what are called multituberculates because of something about the shape of their teeth. They probably didn't bear live young in the same sense as modern mammals. They may have laid eggs. They may have given birth to very undeveloped young, like marsupials, and then cared for them like that. So the fossil record isn't too clear, but it's pretty clear that they were social animals, and that's, 75 million years is a long time for animals, for deep in mammal history, to see that there's social organization. And so again, all these examples are basically to point out how deep in our history social behavior goes. It is really, it's really built in, and we don't know it. It's kind of like a fish doesn't know they're in water. They just swim around. But if it weren't for water, they couldn't swim. And it's like with us, we don't realize how instinctual our social behavior is. It's just kind of there. It's kind of built in, and we never notice it. And that is kind of my central point. And this is one of those examples where I actually put in a credit, because I think this artist deserves credit, because I really like this picture. And the thing is, of course, with social organization, well, not with social organization, but if you're a little plant-eating mammal of some sort, you're going to probably run into some sort of meat-eating mammal. And you're going to want some way to defend yourself against it. And social organizations are part of that. But social organization also works in favor of predators. So we know about lions and wolves and those sorts of animals. And again, we have another arms race where the social organization of the prey has triggered a response in the predator, where the predators become socially organized and use that to counter the prey. And if you've watched TV shows about African savanna and lions and hyenas. They depend on their social organization to overcome the challenges of getting prey. Then we get into mammals. And, well, actually, this is primates. So this primate, this is a really pretty early primate. Not the absolute earliest, probably, but one of the earliest that we have a good fossil of. And this, as it says, it's 47 million years ago. This guy probably, they surmise he probably was hanging out in a tree over a lake, and the lake would occasionally, it had geological features under it that would occasionally release carbon dioxide. So a big bubble of carbon dioxide came up, knocked him out, and he or she dropped into the lake, and because the carbon dioxide was there and stuff, there wasn't a lot to break it down or take it apart. You know, there weren't predators and things like that. So it got preserved really well. And it's called Darwinius massilae, which is a pretty cool name. And this is a chart that lets us get a sort of a broad overview of primates. And so there are lots and lots of them, and they probably go back to about 63 million years. And you can see we're way off on the right there next to the chimpanzees and the gorillas and the orangutans. And it gets less and less closely related to us toward the left. And all of these have social organizations, but broadly speaking, they get more complex on that far right part of the chart. Also brains get bigger, but it's not really an absolute solid connection between brain size and where they are on this. If you go all the way to the left, the lemur is surprisingly competitive with chimpanzees on certain social behaviors. And there's the chimps. Chimps have a social organization that is really not all that far from what ours is like. They live in groups that are 20 to 120 individuals. Their groups split up and recombine, so they don't stay in the one group all the time. Parts of it will, little groups of them will go off and do something separate, and so and then they'll come back and group up with the bigger group. And they are actually really amazingly similar to us, just less developed. And I don't mean that in a better or worse way, but their social structure is a lot simpler, but so similar to what ours is like in a lot of ways. Here's an example of a group that is preparing to have conflict with a neighboring competitive group. These guys would actually have battles. So there's another similarity. I think there are males and females in here. There is an example of a 4-year-long war between two groups of chimps. That I think it's the only example of an extended conflict, but it went on for a long time. And so again, these guys really serve as an analog to what our ancestors were probably like. One of the things that I think people don't understand is that our common ancestor with the chimp was not a chimp. It was something different. And chimps are as evolved as humans. They've just evolved in a different direction. There's some debate over whether their knuckle walking had evolved by the time our common ancestor was around, or if they walked on their palms. So, but they are, in a lot of ways, they tell us what our common ancestor probably was like. And they give us a lot of insight into why we are the way we are. You know, and they've got, now chimps have culture. Chimps pass on information about how to collect food, how to crack nuts, how to do all kinds of things, make weapons even. They have a lot of traits that are very similar to us.
Patrick, can I ask a
Yes,
question?
yes.
You mentioned there's evidence of a 4-year war. Is that an example of just the ability to hold a grudge against a rival group, which would mean that they are remembering past negative behavior from that group and are wanting to fight them? So that's a lot of internalizing anger for a long time, remembering something,
Yes.
right?
I think it is. I mean, I wouldn't want to be too confident about saying that, but I think that is an example of how much they can retain ideas through generations. You know, that's not really generations of chimps, but it's a lot of time for them to keep doing this kind of activity. They do pass on, like that relates to what I was talking about. They have culture in the sense of they show they have to learn how to make nests because they sleep in trees at night in a nest. They learn about food and tools, you know, because some chimps in some places will use a stick to get termites out of a mound, and chimps in another place won't do that. They just, even if there are termites there, they don't do that trick. There are a lot of other things that they have seen that variations in behaviors between chimps that are pretty clearly learned and passed down generation to generation. So yeah, I think it's a case where they held a grudge in some sense. It looks like we might have lost Cheryl. Well, she'll come back. There she is. And chimps hunt. People might not know that chimps actually eat meat. They don't go out of their way. They don't plan hunting trips. They don't go seeking out prey. But I'm going to go back a couple slides, because on this slide to the right of center, there's a colobus monkey, and that is what chimps hunt. If they're going around from location to location, what they mostly do is they know where the fruit, the fruit that's ready to eat is located, and they go from one source of food to another source of food, and they remember where to go and when. And while they're on their travels, if they happen upon a group of colobus monkeys, a lot of times the adults will just spontaneously form a hunting party, and they'll sharpen some sticks and they'll go after them. They'll kill a couple of these monkeys, and they will distribute the parts to their group. There's kind of a hierarchy of who gets how much and what. The chimps that do the hunting get the biggest share, but they also use this as bargaining in their connections to other individuals in the group. So they'll buy loyalty with parts of colobus monkeys. So these guys do hunt, and that turns out to be something that humans do later. This is an Australopithecus. There's a bunch of different kinds of Australopithecus. I think this is an Africanus, but I'm not sure. They behaved a lot like chimps, but they were starting to live in a slightly different environment, more on the ground, and possibly in more open areas, maybe not. But their behavior, other than social, was starting to vary a bit from chimp behavior. But their social behavior was probably really similar. And these guys split off into a number of types, some of which were probably just leaf eaters, and some of which were probably digging for tubers and had more variety of diet. But they were they were becoming pretty bipedal, although there's every indication that they did spend time in trees. The reason we know that their society was similar to chimps is via tooth enamel. You can use isotope ratios to see whether an individual is in his home territory, like his territory of birth, or if he has left his territory of birth. And it turns out that the females tended to leave their group that they were born into and join other groups. And in most animals, the males leave the group and join other groups. And the reason anyone leaves a group is because if they don't, you get inbreeding, and that's bad. So in the case of chimps and Australopithecus, and I think most human ancestors, it was generally the female who left the group. And so they can tell using chemical analysis of teeth that individuals were either in their home territory or had left the place that they were born. And so it was the females, just like in chimps. Things started to change. This is, I think, the first human, Homo species, or one of the earliest ones. And they became more dependent on meat, probably scavenging, maybe hunting. And it really started to have effects on their bodies and their brains. And they had to, if they traveled longer distances over open areas, they probably had to remember, they had to have a map, an internal map in their mind that was more extensive than what a chimp has. They were probably also dealing with, they were more exposed to predators, I would think, than chimps. And so they changed quite a bit, but they still probably at this point, it was probably still the females that left the group and joined another group. And I think that holds true. And then got to these guys. I don't have a full body shot of them, but we're pretty certain that by this point, Homo erectus had lost all their body hair, or virtually all of it. And the reason that's important is because it meant that they had changed their lifestyle. They had started to hunt meat actively. And modern humans who live in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in Africa still do this. What they do is they follow, they don't run down and jump on a fleeing animal. They follow the animal and they wear it down over time. So they they're basically joggers. And to do this in Africa, you need to sweat. And for sweat to work, you can't have hair. And they, I think, genetically know that these guys didn't have body hair. And so that tells us that they had changed the way they get food, and they became a lot more dependent on meat, and they became a lot more active in getting their meat. So this was a big change in our history, and their brains got bigger. It just was. This is a turning point for humans, and yet their society was still really pretty similar to chimps in a lot of ways. In the interactions they had, but it had become more complex. If you take the chimp society and you just add complexity to it, that's probably how these guys behaved. Then we're getting to this guy who, this is getting pretty close to us. This guy, Homo heidelbergensis, is probably the common ancestor to us and Neanderthals and Denisovans, and maybe one or two other as yet undiscovered species of humans. And they had spread out. Now, Homo erectus had spread out all across southern Asia and into Indonesia, and probably, I don't know if you've heard of the hobbit species, the little tiny people that they found in Flores, on the island of Flores. That's a really cool, you got to go Google that. Go Google Homo floresiensis or whatever they're called. And they're like little, like 2 foot, 3 foot tall humans. And they were probably offspring of these guys. But these guys also spread out of Africa and got all over Eurasia, and probably diverged into Neanderthals and Denisovans. And then later on, in Africa, about 300,000 years ago, modern-looking humans evolved. And they kind of developed in Africa for 170,000 years, and then they started spreading out of Africa into the Levant and into Asia and Africa. I mean, Asia and Europe, and interbreeded a little bit with the Denisovans and the Neanderthals because they were just close enough that they could do that. This picture probably illustrates them in that time that they had left Africa. So think of this as probably 70,000 years ago. And, this is a really important time for humans. They were facing some rather severe conditions, and they managed to really do well and eventually outcompete all the other human relatives. And this matters to us because these people were passing down really, really complicated, detailed culture. They had very complicated ways of making stone tools, attaching them to shafts like this, and everything about how they found food and how they made their shelters, everything like that made these guys able to survive was passed down as culture. And the human ability to absorb, especially young people, to absorb massive amounts of information is absolutely essential to how these guys made it through the ice ages and other adverse environments, because they spread out into places that you can't imagine living outside with bare feet and in huts. Although they probably, in the really cold places, they probably made boots. as the guy in the front there. He's kind of ahead of everyone else. And so the thing is that one of the key points of the essay I wrote is that because humans have this innate ability to absorb massive amounts of information, one of the side effects, a byproduct of that, is you can end up with elements that aren't actually correct. So along with all this stuff, how to make a spear point and how to make a hut and how to recognize a tuber that's ready to dig up, you would have also inherited things like, where does the thunder come from? You know, and why does it rain, and what causes the seasons, and all these things that they could not answer, but they were determined to try. And that to me is the root of religion and the root of just in general beliefs that are strongly held, but not based on fact. And I think that is the fundamental problem with modern society. So right there, you can kind of see it happening. You can see all of our problems being planted as a seed that grows into something that now we have to deal with. And so that's a really important, it's kind of a cartoony slide, but it really is a lot more in depth than you would think. After that, there was a period when people were starting to settle down and becoming less nomadic, but they had not really given up hunting and gathering. They still relied on the naturally occurring food sources and building sources in their environment. They still hunted wild animals and they still gathered wild plant foods. But that set them up for a new kind of thing that changed everything. You know, if you look at this picture, you've got a hut there and you've got all these reeds or whatever. You know, there would have been plants around, and they would eventually have figured out that, you know, what if we just, it looks like where these seeds drop, the plant grows. What if we collect the seeds and plant them where we want them, the kinds that we want, where we want them, and keep doing that? And that, of course, led to the Neolithic Revolution. And this actually, I jumped ahead a little bit. This amazing place called Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture. These people were hunter-gatherers, semi-settled hunter-gatherers, and apparently they would gather together and build this amazing monolithic stuff. And they weren't even farming yet. But it shows you that society was organized and complex to a very high degree, even before farming. And then you had farming. And that was just a massive change. And people settled down, and little by little, for over the centuries, over millennia actually, they got better and better at it. And it triggered a massive increase in population. And this is the beginnings of another massive turning point in our ancestry, in our history. Because when that population exploded, kind of in slow motion for a few millennia, and then it really got going. They started building cities. They moved from huts like this, and there was enough of a population where people would gather together in cities. And you had all sorts of things happen there. One of the things was that you had division of labor and specialization, where not everyone was involved in producing food, because you could have a minority of the people out there, or a subset of the society out there in the field producing food, and then other people who didn't work in the fields, who were doing all kinds of other things, bronze working, you know, all the other stuff that a society needs. And another thing that happened at this point was hierarchy. You started getting kings and priests and craftsmen and farmers, and and it's the beginnings of our stratified society that we have today. So let's see here. And one of the interesting things about the very first cities was that they didn't have walls. You know, you think of a city and you think of city walls, because of course you have other cities that want their stuff. And the first cities just did not have walls. But the second cities did. As soon as those cities were burnt down, the next cities that got built in the same spot, they had walls. And so not just walls, but they had temples. And they built some big stuff. It was really crazy what started going on at, 5,000, 4,000, 3,000 years ago. They were producing so much surplus that they could do things like this. They could dedicate labor to this. And this is I don't know if you know, this is rebuilt. It's a rebuilt ziggurat, and these were basically temples. So the priest class had enough leverage to to get people to build these things and give them resources. And so at this point, you had people that were producing resources and other people that were getting the resources, and we kind of know how that is. But you also had rival cities, and these cities would, you'd have some king who would want to show how great he was and take over other cities. And that just happened all over the place. As soon as there were a few cities, people were starting to do this. And I think it's really tied into that innate absorption of a belief system and a set of knowledge that was originally evolved in order to make humans, or in order to allow humans to survive in adverse conditions. But it kind of got co-opted, and you have these unexpected, unplanned side effects of things like that. And one of them is religions, and they're really deeply ingrained. And so you had to have one city that had its own religion, and then you had a city a few miles away that had to us a barely indistinguishable, but to them an absolutely unacceptably different religion. And so you would get conflict. Sometimes they would cooperate, and sometimes they would fight it out to get resources, or but even if they were fighting for resources, the fact that the other city, the other people were other and they were different, made it okay to go and take their stuff, to kill them, or to take them captive as slaves, because they were other, because the people in our city perceived those people in the other city as them and different. It was okay to behave pretty badly toward them. And again, I think we see that today. I think that is just a fundamental problem in modern society. And here I did a little sort of cartoon illustration of this process, where in hunter-gatherer you have these, say, these three primary color tribal identities, and they're geographically separated, and maybe there are a few scattered individuals traveling between them, but you have mostly geographically separated groups that don't really conflict. And that evolves to the early farmers, that were still, the populations were going up, but you still pretty much had people that were separated enough that their beliefs didn't trigger conflict. But once you get to the first cities, these people were within easy reach of each other. They were interacting, they were probably engaging in trade, and they inevitably engaged in war because they saw what the other people had, and they were other and different, and it was okay to go take their stuff, or to go and make them believe what we believe. And so you kind of had the beginnings of conflict there, and then pretty soon you had people mixing, you know, people from one group traveling around and living amongst people of a different belief system. That's kind of what this is. And so you've got all this stuff starting to mix. And now it's just, you know, you've got some areas where you've got some areas where people are pretty much homogenous, but in most of the world, you're going to run up against, you can't avoid interacting with people that have different beliefs than you. It's just, nobody can really go very far without encountering somebody that is different in their belief system. And that's, I think, a problem that we are facing now. And that actually is the topic that my essay covers. And there's, I'm gonna real quick open up that file because it has a couple of things, phrases that I like. So there's the concept of let's see if I can get to the end of this essay here. Oh boy.
While you're finding that, Patrick,
yes.
I was just thinking as you were talking,
Yes.
that I think that groups naturally, when they get too big, they find differences amongst the group and then just naturally separate along those difference lines.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not possible for a group to get so large, continue to stay large and sustain that large group without infighting and then eventual fall and breakup.
It could be. What I'm thinking is that we've got this legacy of all these multiple, like, overlapping, unsubstantiated beliefs that are floating. They're like memes. I think, didn't Richard Dawkins, or was it Sagan, create the concept of memes? But anyway, these ideas are floating around and they get into people's heads, and we haven't rigorously gone through our beliefs as a society and said, well, you know, maybe this one doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, and here's one that's kind of we're not sure about yet. It might be true, might not. We can't really prove it either way. And then here are some that stand up to scrutiny pretty well. And so I think, it's really hard to convince somebody once they believe something, once they've, especially from childhood, once they've been taught that a certain thing is true. I think most of us have a really strong instinct to hold on to that for life. And these things, a lot of them will just sit latent in somebody's mind, and somebody, they're not active. They're just sort of back there, and they don't do anything until what you're talking about. Something happens, and then there's some kind of conflict or disagreement, and then these things start popping up. They try to, find something to explain why they disagree with somebody, and then these conflicting beliefs sort of they rise to the surface, and they get used to say, well, you're wrong because of this. And I don't think we have as a society gone through and said, a lot of people believe this, but there's not good reason for it, and so the thing I was looking for is this thing I wrote. Most of humanity's conflict derives from this cultural feature: multiple geographically overlapping, mutually incompatible, fiction-based tribal identities. And so, and not only do we, each of us isn't just one tribal identity. We have tribal identities that are multi-layered in each of us. We have we think of ourselves as a certain nationality, a member of a certain subset of society, maybe a school identity or a church identity, or like even atheist group identity and stuff like that. And all of these identities have little beliefs associated with them, and we can even be conflicted within ourselves, not just between individuals. And so I think it would be worthwhile to try to find some way to just go through, it would be a massive project, and probably impossible, but I'd like to dream, and to say, well, why don't we subject what we believe to scrutiny and keep the good stuff? Because there's some good stuff in pretty much every belief system, and it's probably in most cases good stuff that is the same stuff as other belief systems. The golden rule, things like that. And so there's good stuff in all this, and I think we need to find the good stuff and hang on to it, and try to find the stuff that maybe isn't quite up to snuff, and try to find ways to let it go, which I think is basically education, critical thinking, all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of where it all ends, where it all wraps up for me.
Patrick, did you want to share your essay? Either provide a link, or how can people read that?
Oh yeah, sure. I can do that. I'll put it in the chat. Let me find it, and